We don't have the official versions yet to ship up here. It's wonderful to be able to hand those out to all of you. I may be the only person in this entire conference who doesn't have PowerPoint for you. You'll have to forgive me. I didn't really see a reason for it. I guess I give up any chance of having a Nobel Prize now. Let me tell you a bit about this task force broadly before I get into the details. Firstly, what the heck is one of these task forces? They sponsor a few of these a year on a subject of importance in foreign policy with some level of controversy, but where we think we can get something other than a lowest common denominator output. The Council on Foreign Relations itself doesn't take any institutional positions. It's just the people on the task force who are coming out with the report. In this case, a group of 29 people, the group co-chaired by former governors George Pataki and Tom Vilsack, and a really diverse set of people. And you can see, I think, on the third page of the report that was handed out, a very wide range of people, not just from across the entire political spectrum, but from a variety of backgrounds and a variety of experiences. And I should say that Governor Pataki is very sorry that he could not be here today to speak at lunch and to be here for this session, but does send his best wishes to everyone. We started this, we conceived of it about a year and a half ago. We had our first meeting last July, and we met 4 times over the course of roughly a year, and in between circulated a variety of drafts of this thing and went through it and hacked it back and forth and published it on the 13th of June, about a week and a half ago. And just to be clear, when I'm presenting these findings and recommendations of this task force, what we're talking about is a consensus from this group on the central thrust and the basic judgments of the report, not necessarily on every single finding and recommendation. We also provide members an opportunity to write specific additions or dissents at the end if they want to, in order to have us, avoid watering everything down completely to get a consensus judgment. Very few additions or dissents on the report. A couple other bits of preliminaries. This is very much a US-centered report in an important sense, in the sense that this is a strategy for US foreign policy. It's not strictly about an endpoint for where the world should be when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions or what a final deal should be. It's about strategy. And to talk about strategy, you need to have someone who is executing that strategy. And in this case, the recommendations are to the United States for executing a strategy, but understanding that you can't have a sensible strategy, a smart strategy, without understanding the positions of the rest of the world, how other countries, how other players come to the problem. So it's at once a very much an international look, but also an American look at the problem. Also, a quick word about how this sits within politics. Okay? This is not a completely blue sky thing where we throw aside politics and say what exactly would happen in a perfect world. Firstly, you've got a very diverse set of people. Politics is ultimately going to come into it. Secondly, we want to be ambitious. We want to push the edges of what we can do politically. But we also know that we're proposing a set of things that have to fit together. And it's important that those different pieces, in some sense, be realistic. And when we think about international policy, we're quite ready to think about the political constraints that a government in China, for example, might operate under, or government in the UK. It's important to also think about the constraints within the United States at the same time as we look at how to push those forward. Let me step through the report in a few pieces. We start by looking at the basic drivers, or what the drivers should be for climate policy. We talk about what a US domestic agenda should be, and then we turn to the main focus of the report, which is foreign policy. We start that by taking a step back, looking at all the levers that the United States has available to it, and then looking at how those come together in a couple important fora. One is in the negotiations over a post-Kyoto deal, and the other is in other sorts of international fora, in particular a new one that we proposed. And we end by talking about leadership and about how to actually move this forward. So first question, and this is how we started the process. We asked ourselves, why do we care about climate change? And why do we care about getting climate change policy right? Because presumably, a lot of our prescriptions should flow from that kind of assessment. And we had 4 basic foundations. The first of which is, it's important to be trying to avoid dangerous climate change. Okay? This is one of 4. And we had this discussion a bit this morning about the expected outcomes of different trajectories versus the risks of very high consequence, low probability events. And different people in the group had different motivations. Some were more concerned about the expected outcomes. Some were more concerned about those long tails of the probability distribution. But everyone agreed that this was a high risk that we needed to confront. The second is economics, and this comes on both sides. It's important to get climate policy right because the wrong climate policy can be very costly. At the same time, and in particular, can be costly to vulnerable groups. At the same time, the right climate policy can capture a lot of important economic opportunities, new jobs, new industries. The third piece was energy security, and again, it cuts both ways. There are a lot of opportunities for synergies between a smart climate policy and a smart energy security policy. Efficiency is an obvious example where the two dovetail. Renewable is another example where the two dovetail together. There are obvious places where the two can conflict. Look at unconventional oil, for example, or coal to liquids. Other more subtle things like largely increased reliance on natural gas, for example, could be problematic. So again, important to have a smart climate strategy so that you can capture the synergies and try to avoid the conflicts between those two sorts of agendas. And part number 4, reclaiming American leadership more broadly. The United States has been left behind, largely by its own choice, I would say, on this subject. But re-engaging it isn't just a matter of establishing an ability to shape the climate agenda, but putting the United States in a position where it can be more effective in pursuing its foreign policy agenda much more broadly, beyond the climate sphere. So those 4 pieces all shape our thinking on what strategy and policy should be. With that background, we talk about domestic policy. And I'm just going to drill down some of the basics of our domestic policy proposals. At the core of our proposals, we need to put a price on carbon that takes us toward substantially lower emissions. And what we recommend is a cap-and-trade system that begins reducing emissions now and that aims initially at reductions of 60 to 80% below 1990 levels by mid-century. Okay? We're mindful that there's a lot we're going to learn along the way about science, about technology, about economics, about how policy translates into practice. And so we're clear about the need to periodically revisit and revise what we're doing. And this applies here, and it applies across all of the recommendations in the report, that we need to learn as we go along. But this is at the center of our domestic policy proposals. We did discuss the relative advantages of a cap-and-trade system versus a carbon tax for putting a broad price on carbon. In the end, we didn't judge one to be theoretically better in principle than the other, but we did feel that for the United States to reclaim leadership, it needed to focus on something that it would be able to get done relatively soon. And we also thought it was very important to get the details of whichever approach we had right, to make sure that the burden wasn't put on the least advantaged and the most vulnerable. And by focusing on one particular approach, by focusing on a cap-and-trade approach, we could focus the political system on getting it right. And that was critically important. We're also clear, though, that a cap-and-trade system by itself was not going to be enough. And we pointed at 4 specific things that needed to be done in addition. The first was measures that directly target consumption of oil. Okay? If you want to build a broad agenda, a broad energy policy agenda, and a broad coalition, you need to not just be taking on climate change by itself. And measures that take on overdependence on oil can have payoffs in multiple dimensions, would be underutilized simply by enacting a cap-and-trade system, and are important to target themselves. Number 2, and there are places where we will need direct regulation. And obviously one of the groups, I'm sure, has been speaking a good bit about this today. There are places where markets fail, and we will need direct regulation to deal with market failures. And again, efficiency is an obvious example here. In a cap-and-trade system, small emitters may be another case that you might look at. The third, there's a need for substantial and increasing government support for research, development, and demonstration projects. Okay? There are market failures that need to be dealt with. The group was quite cautious that it was important to take a broad portfolio approach. It didn't really have a sense that this was some kind of Apollo project, but it did think that this was an important role for the government to play. And the fourth part, and the governors in particular found this important, but as did many of the task force members, the need to make sure that the enabling infrastructure for a transition to low carbon economy could be put in place. And while we didn't endorse any specific infrastructure project, we made clear that if you don't allow liquefied natural gas terminals, if you don't allow pipelines, if you don't allow nuclear waste storage, if you don't do CCS infrastructure, and if you don't do the regulations that you need to have long-range transmission so that you can do renewables properly, you are going to severely limit your options for moving to a low-carbon economy and drive up the price of getting there. So enabling infrastructure is a critical component here. That's the basics of the domestic agenda that we outlined. And against that backdrop, we look at foreign policy. The first thing we did was, like I said at the beginning, we stepped back. And we asked ourselves, what are the levers at our disposal? What are the different tools that we can bring to bear on this problem? We stressed right at the beginning that focus was essential. In a domestic policy, we can go after a ton of different sources, a ton of different opportunities. In foreign policy, it's really critical to be focused. And we wanted to be focused firstly on the biggest emitters in the world. Okay? That's the biggest advanced industrial countries and the biggest developing countries. We want to be focused on the biggest sources of emissions: coal and power and industry, oil and transportation, and also in other places, and forests. Those are the three key places we wanted to focus in foreign policy. And then we looked at each of these countries, and I'm not going to go into depth into each of them, but I'll say we looked at a variety of things in each case, at the different motivations, one of which is dealing with climate change, but more prominently in most cases are economics, security concerns, and social concerns, including public health. We also looked at the competence of different countries. Different countries have different capabilities, different governments have different capabilities to implement particular solutions, and it's important to have those sorts of things in mind as you're crafting a foreign policy strategy. We went through a long list of tools, and I'm actually going to step through each of these quite quickly because I think it's very important to understand that there is not going to be one or even a couple magic bullet diplomatic approaches to sort out the climate change problem. We often talk about how there's no silver bullet technology that's going to solve climate change problem. There's no silver bullet diplomatic solution either to the problem. And we went through a lot of different options. Some are uncontroversial, cooperating with countries to help them understand the effects of dangerous climate change on themselves. A lot of countries are already doing this, but there are opportunities for cooperation. Cooperation, international cooperation on research, development, and demonstration projects. Just like there are first mover disadvantages in some cases for R&D domestically, there are places internationally where the country, the government that invests can't necessarily capture all the advantages. There are also important situations where the technologies might be developed in one country but will need to be deployed elsewhere. And it'll be important to have demonstration projects that help validate those technologies. We talked about technical cooperation as being essential. That doesn't just mean engineering, it means legal codes, it means regulations, it means all sorts of things. And then we were very clear that policymakers often, especially diplomats, often denigrate this sort of thing as being sort of small potatoes. It's incredibly important. There's a lot you can unlock through technical cooperation, and it's very important for governments to be encouraging that. We then got into some of the thornier issues that involve essentially subsidizing emissions reductions, the most obvious one being offsetting. And the group was quite clear that though there have been some successes, the clean development mechanism has largely failed in accomplishing its goal of effecting major changes in energy systems in developing countries, and that it will need to be strongly reformed. Firstly, it needs to be expanded in scope to take a more aggressive approach on deforestation. But at the same time, it needs to be sharpened. And we argued that there needs to be a focus on a smaller set of opportunities, at least initially, rather than on having 1,000 different methodologies. Focusing on a small set of opportunities and trying to get them right. It is impossible to sit down and figure out on paper how to get an offset system right. This is going to be a trial and error sort of thing. It's something where we are going to need to be able to focus and learn from experience. It's also somewhere where a US cap and trade system, through its market power, can really drive things in a constructive direction. But as with all the other tools, we're also clear that there is not going to be a way to sort out how offsets will solve our problem of steering developing countries in a constructive, or helping, I should say, to steer developing countries in a constructive direction. This is going to be one of many different pieces. In particular, on the financial front, we talked about climate funds as a supplement. So the government funds that would either subsidize emissions reduction activities or activities that would prepare the ground for emissions reductions, or that could buy technology and resell it at a discount, eliminating that extra cost of cleaner technology. Again, we're generally supportive, but we also recognize that at a minimum, politically, it's going to be very difficult to have these sorts of funds subsidize large transfers to major economic competitors. We didn't see that as a reason to rule it out. We saw that as a reason to try to put these things as part of bigger packages. And again, this comes back to looking at a bigger foreign policy picture. So for example, you might look at making access to a large-scale clean technology fund for China part of a package where certain intellectual property issues were addressed, or certain trade issues were addressed. Looking beyond the climate sphere for new levers to steer things in new directions. It's not only about money. This was something we really wanted to emphasize. One of the areas we looked at along those lines was security of supply for fuels that would help with low carbon development. In particular, we looked at security of supply for natural gas and at security of supply for nuclear fuel. It's not a matter of pushing gas or nuclear on a particular country, but on removing barriers. So if a country like India wanted to shift to more gas or to more nuclear, but saw security of supply as a major barrier, that's something we would look to remove by improving security of supply, whether it's by building reliable gas markets, whether it's by building reliable supply of nuclear fuel. These are not traditional financial levers that you think about in climate policy, but they can have substantial effects, and we thought those were important to pursue. I should make an important distinction. In the nuclear area, we emphasize focusing nuclear efforts on countries that already have nuclear power, and we were very cautious on countries that don't already have it because of the proliferation concerns in particular. We talked a bit about trade policy and how that provided levers. Obvious positive levers through export promotion, having things like OPIC and Exim Bank put more emphasis on clean technology in choosing projects that they support. We also took on a controversial issue these days of trade penalties. Whether you want to call them carbon tariffs or covering permits or whatever euphemism you'd like, it's obviously a big deal in Washington to talk about putting penalties on imports from countries that have not, as the United States judges, taken sufficient measures to reduce their emissions. We were extremely skeptical of this concept. We did not want to dismiss it, but we saw it as being very difficult to implement in practice. We saw it as opening a very dangerous door to it being used against the United States. We did not see it as a particularly strong lever against the countries that it would be aimed at. And on top of that, it seemed a bit disconsonant for the United States to announce, we're returning to the world scene. One of the big multilateral things we're going to do is work with you on climate change. By the way, we're about to violate the WTO. Okay? And there was also a general feeling that this would complicate the trade agenda, no matter what your trade agenda was. If your trade agenda is fairer trade, if your trade agenda is freer trade, whatever it is, this is a complication where the payoff doesn't appear to be worth it. Like I said, we did not want to remove it from the table. We talk about building multilateral agreement on what kinds of tariffs might be appropriate, but we did not want this to be a central piece, something aggressively brandished as part of American foreign policy. The last specific tool we talked about in the toolkit was how we deal, in the foreign policy toolkit, was how we deal with biofuels. And I think this is notable for a task force, one of whose co-chairs is the former governor of Iowa. We endorse reductions, as a broad principle, reductions of tariffs on imported biofuels, mindful that actions on that front should be done in a context where we seek to avoid provoking deforestation and other land use change that really outweighs the value, the climate value of changes in biofuels tariffs. And we also support phasing out of subsidies for mature ethanol, including corn-based ethanol. We also sort of have a catch-all group of levers which have broader incentives. It essentially means tying things to broader foreign policy issues. As you raise climate up the agenda, you do have more complications, you have more opportunities to tie things to broader goals. And one example I'd give of this is Russia's ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. There are a lot of problems with that. We won't get into all the details of it, but sometimes people will criticize it, in particular, for having been part of a deal where Russian accession to WTO was supported in exchange for Russia becoming part of Kyoto Protocol, ratifying the Kyoto Protocol. Somehow this dirtied things. At least as I see it, that's actually an example of the sort of thing we should be looking for, okay? Being pure about it is not the goal. The goal is to get people to take action. And if drawing on incentives from beyond the traditional climate sphere is what we need to do that, absolutely we should be pursuing those sorts of routes. So with that set of tools laid out, we then talk about how to bring them together. Now, a lot of these are going to be used piecemeal, but it's important to focus them in two particular areas. The first, most obvious one, is negotiations for a post-Kyoto deal. Negotiations through the Bali Roadmap aimed at a deal in Copenhagen at the end of 2009. We stressed the importance of vigorous U.S. engagement in that process, though we also stressed the importance of being realistic about the potential for a big deal to come through. We laid down 5 negotiating principles for the United States in that process. 1, seek agreement on global reductions in emissions, a global halving of emissions by mid-century. Number 2, the advanced industrial countries, including the United States, should be willing to sign up to their own domestic commitments as part of an international deal. That means caps. Number 3, we should not be asking for caps from the rapidly emerging economies. We should be asking for commitments to specific actions that we expect to have strong effects from them. Okay? We are skeptical of asking for caps because we have a feeling that if we get them, they will be very high and largely meaningless. And at the same time, we're not so sure that governments have the capacity to deliver on what it is that they promise. Better to ask for things that governments can actually control. They will have more confidence to promise things that are more ambitious, and we will be more able to hold them to it if it's more closely tied to what they can control. Okay? Number 3, a reform financing scheme. That means reforming clean development mechanism. I won't go into all the detail, but flowing on what I said earlier, and also developing these climate funds. Last piece, adaptation. Adaptation needs to be a significant part of an international deal. That means primarily setting up mechanisms to harmonize adaptation efforts, to integrate them, to make sure we're delivering where we need to. At the same time, we are skeptical of efforts that would set aside very large amounts of money for adaptation support. There are legitimate concerns in a lot of developing countries that urgently needed development aid on traditional things like health, like education, are going to be pushed aside by a rush to fill the coffers of adaptation assistance funds. There are places where adaptation assistance can be targeted strategically, but in general, mainstreaming adaptation assistance into broader development assistance, we judge to make more sense. And that's true inside or outside a UN deal. Now, I should be clear. We said that these pieces come as part of a package, and in particular, the commitments to particular targets from advanced countries and the commitments to actions from the rapidly emerging economies had to come as a part of a package. That didn't condition our domestic proposals, but it did mean that if the emerging economies were not going to sign up to ambitious actions as part of a deal, that the developed countries should not be signing up to targets as part of a deal. Separate issue from what action should be taken domestically. And we said as a backup plan that if we can't get that sort of deal, there should be an agreement amongst the developed countries to cement their goals together, to provide a foundation for carbon trading, a legal foundation, to provide more certainty for firms, for planning, and for other countries, but that they do that as a group by themselves. That if they're not going to get significant commitments from others, they should be doing that at least so that they have, as a collective, some flexibility. We're not, like I said, hugely optimistic. We don't expect a deal. We don't expect there not to be a deal. It's very difficult to predict where countries will be in a year and a half. It's very difficult to predict where negotiations will go. But we did think it was essential, in part for that, but in part for a host of other reasons, to build another process that we call Partnership for Climate Cooperation. And this is an effort focused on the biggest emitters in the world, but it's fundamentally different from the major economies meetings process that the Bush administration has pushed. The one similarity is that it is big economies and big emitters. But it's fundamentally different in a few ways. First, this is would be a relatively informal group aimed where the goal would be to catalyze specific actions, smaller deals, informal commitments, either to reduce emissions or to provide incentives to reduce emissions, in contrast with the major economies meetings, which are aimed at pre-negotiating, if you want to be charitable, are aimed at pre-negotiating a post-Kyoto deal. Very different goal. This is not about a feed into the UN process. This is about focusing on specific actions on the ground. What's the motivation behind this? One, we're heading into pretty uncharted territories here. And countries tend to sign up to things that they know they can deliver on. Well, if you're heading into uncharted territories, that can often really restrain you. That doesn't just mean in terms of setting goals for reducing emissions, it's also in terms of offering up incentives. A more flexible approach can often unlock more ambitious efforts. To have credibility in that, though, you really need to raise it to the highest level. You need to raise it to the level of leaders in countries. And to be able to draw across the spectrum of tools, you need to raise it to the level of leaders in countries. And that really means having a focused single process. You can have a proliferation of bilateral and regional efforts, and those can be valuable in a lot of ways. But the president is not going to show up to every bilateral climate meeting and every regional climate meeting. You need to have that focal point, we argue, where you can really raise things up, have countries make offers, have countries make commitments. They may not be signed in stone, but they can be held to them, they can be periodically reviewed, and countries can intensify efforts where they're succeeding, and they can shift course where they're not. And we see the two pieces, the UN piece and the partnership piece, as very much complementary. If countries sign up to ambitious commitments as part of a United Nations deal, as part of a post-Kyoto deal, they're still going to need a lot of help in meeting those commitments. And the partnership effort, along with other efforts, can help them meet those. And if countries aren't willing to sign up to ambitious commitments, well, experience and practice on the ground in meeting different commitments can help build the confidence they need to sign up to things that are more ambitious in the longer term. Last little piece, bringing all this together, is leadership. Absolutely essential. These things are not going to happen without leadership. And that means presidential leadership or vice presidential leadership. The president or vice president needs to make energy policy, we argue, including climate change, but climate is integrated into broad energy policy, a personal priority if these sorts of things are going to happen. And at the same time, they are going to need very close cooperation with Congress, okay? Don't think of this as traditional environmental diplomacy. Think of this a bit more like trade diplomacy. There needs to be a very close cooperation because of the effects on the economy that these steps have. There's going to need to be congressional presence in negotiations. There's going to need to be very close cooperation. We talk about different mechanisms. I won't get into the guts of those. Final piece before I turn it over to Jeremy. People come back and ask a lot about this. They say, well, a lot of this foreign policy vision is predicated on big, ambitious domestic action. Doesn't seem like that's going to happen. Why don't you just focus on the domestic piece? Let's get that out of the way. Then we can deal with foreign policy. I'll say, I have a suspicion that a smart, credible foreign policy vision could be a key piece of the domestic political puzzle. We talk about this chicken and egg problem. The United States needs to take action first, but it's hard for it to take action without others doing something. Well, a part-way step to that is for the United States to take action first, but with leaders who have articulated a credible vision that the population actually believes will then ultimately bring along other countries. If you have that kind of leadership and that kind of vision, we may be able to get, over time, a strong, sustainable solution. Thank you.